Okay, good morning. We are now going to conclude, round this all up, which is what began this whole discussion, which is the question of whether it's appropriate on Shabbos morning, Shabbos afternoon by Kiddush, to begin with the Kayn. Right? Halachically speaking, the essence of Kiddush is just the Bayrach. As we learned over the last few days, there's been custom that has evolved over time to augment that bracha with citation to verses or passages that honor the Shabbos. And that way, kind of raise the status of this bracha, this Bayrach. Yesterday, we learned from the Shana Koilol, from Rabbi Avram David Lavut, a beautiful explanation about the spiritual significance of the Shabbos morning Kiddush and why specifically we don't do a bracha. We don't do a bracha on the Shabbos Day Kiddush except for our Gofen. We don't bless the Shabbos because Kayn Bayrach Hashem Misim Shabbos. Because of the Shabbos day, therefore God blesses. It's associated with the Yudke Vavke based on the Rebbeinu Bachaye, and therefore it's the divine investure of transcendence into the Shabbos day, and therefore we don't make Kiddush, and therefore meaning we don't make the bracha of Kiddush, and that's why the Kayn is in bold. The Kayn is in bold because everything until then is describing how we observe the Shabbos. Okay, but the main thing is that Hashem responds and says, and therefore Hashem bless the Shabbos. And that's why those words are in bold. That's what we left off yesterday. He didn't address this question about whether it's appropriate to begin with the words Kayn. But as we'll see in the discussion today, what he said is going to have some bearing on that discussion. Okay. So again, just make it clear, there's nothing wrong with just beginning by Pergofen, because that's the halachic obligation for Kiddush in the morning, just to say by Pergofen. But as per custom, and as per consideration of the content, is it appropriate to begin with Kayn, considering that the word Kayn, number one, it's the middle of a pasuk. The pasuk begins with Kishesh Yomim. We start with a pasuk or two earlier. We start with Zachar Shem Shabbos Kache, which is the beginning of that paragraph in the Torah. And then the last pasuk is Kishesh Yomim. Therefore, because God created the world in the 7 days, in the 6 days He created the heaven and the earth, and He rested on the seventh. Therefore, God created. Therefore, God blessed it. So saying therefore without a preamble, just contextually doesn't make sense. Kayn, therefore He blessed because of what? You didn't say anything. So that would be one reason why maybe it's inappropriate to begin with Kayn, just because it doesn't flow. And another issue, as we'll see in a moment, is because it's mid-pasuk. And one doesn't begin mid-pasuk. So now let's see 3 different approaches to addressing this question of whether or not it's appropriate to begin with that line Kayn, or is one required to start earlier, or not to say anything at all, just get to Pergofen. Because you remember, the Shulchan Aruch certainly, but even the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch did not mention any paragraphs other than the Hagofen. That's the essence of the Kiddush. The other paragraphs are only added by Sidurim as custom, Kabbalistic custom, or customs that go back to the Kolboy and earlier. So the 3 approaches today are going to come first from the Chaim in the Mishna Berura, in his book called the Mishna Berura. So you can see at the bottom of the page there, those are the 2 scholars we're looking at first. On the left is the Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kayn, the famous Chaim, author of the Mishna Berura, which is like, the Mishna Berura is like a compendium to the Shulchan Aruch. It's meant to be read along with the Shulchan Aruch itself, Rabbi Yosef Karo Shulchan Aruch, and he has like an updated halacha. Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch is written, it was in the 1500s. This is in the 1800s, early 1900s. So in a few hundred years, customs have evolved and so on. So the Mishna Berura kind of just is a run-along companion to add where things are missing in the Shulchan Aruch itself. He also has another sidebar where he gives deeper explanation, but the main gist of the Mishna Berura is this. And he was a Rosh Yeshiva in Radin. You can see there on the map. It's Lithuania, not far from Vilna, which is north of that. To the left there, that ocean is it is not the Black Sea, it's the, I looked it up a bunch of times to try to remember. I can't remember. Which sea is it? It's the one that borders like Norway. Lithuania and yes.
It's cold anyway.
Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea, I believe. I believe it's the Caspian Sea. I believe it's the Caspian Sea. Yeah. I believe it is. We can even look it up since we have the internet in front of us. Oops, what was that about? That was a mistake, sorry. Caspian Sea. Yeah, that's it. Yes, good morning. Yes, the Caspian Sea at any rate, so that's the Radin. No, I don't know if it's the Caspian Sea. Sorry? Why isn't it zooming out? No, it's the Baltic Sea, not the Caspian Sea. The Caspian Sea is farther east. It's the Baltic Sea. Okay, it's the Baltic Sea. Sorry? Yeah, it doesn't matter. The Baltic Sea. And a little bit to the west, south, is a city called Novardok. And that is where the other scholar is from. They're contemporaries. Rabbi Yechiel Michal Halevi Epstein, the famous Aruch Hashulchan. He was the rabbi of Novardok. Now, the Chaim was Rosh Yeshiva. And Rabbi Yechiel Epstein was not a Rosh Yeshiva, he was the Rav. But nonetheless, he had many students that would come to the yeshiva of Novardok to actually study by him, even though he was not the official Rosh Yeshiva. But many students would study by him. In fact, my brother-in-law tells me that his great-great-grandfather or something like that was one such student who went to Novardok, even though there were great scholars in Novardok, and many did go for that. Novardok being famous for a certain school of Musar from the Alter. But my brother-in-law's great-great-grandfather, amongst some others, went to the yeshiva to learn by the rabbi of the city, even though the rabbi wasn't officially employed by the yeshiva, the author of the Aruch Hashulchan, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Levi Epstein. So they're two contemporaries, right? You can see the dates are, I think Rabbi Epstein's a little bit older, 10 years older, right? 1829 versus 1838. Rabbi Epstein, the Aruch Hashulchan's a little older, but they're still contemporaries, and they're living not far from each other. And they're both within the school of the Litvisha learning, right? It's right near Lithuania, the border of Lithuania and Belarus, which is actually the region of where Chabad also operates. Lubavitch's headquarters is also in Belarus, which is why the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad 100 years earlier, was known amongst his Hasidic contemporaries as the Litvak. He was the Litvak Chassid. Yeah, all kinds of interesting historical realities about that, and which is also why the Chabad community was most heavily involved in the Hasidic, non-Hasidic controversies that existed 100 years earlier, because they lived in the same region. They lived in Belarus, Latvia, that area. Anyway, these are the two scholars we're going to be looking at today, and then the third one in a moment.
I wonder if that was the origin of the Shtreimels.
This isn't the origin of the Shtreimel, but he would have. It could be the Shtreimel began from the keeping the head warm, but it started earlier. Actually, it was the Jews in general, religious Jews in general, dressed like the aristocracy. This is the Shulchan Aruch says this, that the Jew as a representative of Hashem and as a servant of Hashem, especially if he was involved in Torah study and was somewhat of a scholarly nature, then he would dress aristocratically, at least somewhat, because he's a servant of Hashem, he's a representative. So, which is why the Hasidic garb looks like 1800s aristocracy. Long coat with the vest, because they're maintaining that look of the aristocracy. That's really what it comes down to. Is that a Jew should dress like an aristocrat. Which is why modern Jews today, Orthodox Jews who consider themselves Torah studiers or representatives, would wear a button-down shirt, a jacket, a fedora, because that would be like the aristocratic dress of America, right? So it's a common thing throughout history that Jews would dress in the manner that the aristocracy did, considering that they were representative of Hashem and so on. So I don't know at which point the Shtreimel came along. I'm sure there's all kinds of history written about it. I don't know enough about it.
Why do some of them wear their tzitzis outside of their clothes?
Most of them wore their tzitzis above their shirts.
Yeah,
I believe that's the way it was back then. I don't know that undershirts was a thing. Meaning, I only wear it under my shirt because between my tzitzis and my body, I have an undershirt. I'm guessing in the 1800s, in the 1700s, 1600s, undershirts wasn't a thing yet. So they wore their tzitzis above their shirt and then the vest on top of it to keep it neat, I assume. I don't know. I'm sure there's all kinds of stuff written about the history of this garb, and I'm not familiar.
Look up the history.
Yeah. Chabad, the idea of clothing was never much made of a to-do. So it's not like official Chabad garb. So it's not something that I, spent too much time on. So I don't know the history, but I'm sure there are many scholars who written about it. Okay, so these are the first two scholars we're going to be looking at to address this question. Is it appropriate to begin with the Al-Kayn? And we're going to start with the Mishna Berura. This is in chapter 289. This is that chapter 289 that we read in Alta B'Shulchan Aruch, the laws of Shabbos Day Kiddush. We started off with that way back when. We learned the laws of Shabbos Day Kiddush. That the table has to be set when one comes home. We discussed whether it's appropriate to be eating before the Shabbos Day Kiddush. Drinking water, yes, but eating, no. All those laws are in chapter 289. And here's the Mishna Berura he reads. Second line in that picture there on the first image text box. Yeah. Yesh Noyagin. There are those that have the custom. L'ftoyach, to begin, mitchila, first, before Kiddush, Shabbos Day. Pasuk, the pasuk, v'shamru b'nei Yisrael, v'gomer, etc. That's one of the paragraphs we read, is v'shamru. Some say that before Kiddush. Or Zachar Sema Shabbos Advei Kadasheu. Or there would be the other pasuk, which is Zachar Sema Shabbos, which is we also say that. That's the last paragraph we say, which concludes with Al Kayn Bayrach Hashem Sema Shabbos Advei Kadasheu. So some read this, some read that, right? Which is probably still true today. Some Sidurim have that paragraph, some Sidurim have that paragraph. Our Siddur has both paragraphs plus other ones, right? Okay. Meaning Sidurim were already a thing in print at this time. But he's just making note that there are some Sidurim this way and some Sidurim that way, and it's all okay. That's kind of what he's saying. And he says, Yesh Mahamoin, there are those of the masses, meaning not scholars, not people who understand. They're the masses who don't realize what they're doing. Shepoischim Al Kayn, they begin with the words Al Kayn Bayrach, and therefore God blessed. It says in Mishna Berura, V'shaloika din asu, they are doing so inappropriately. Even though the Kiddush, halachically, as far as the law goes, is only hagafen. So what could be wrong with adding the line Al Kayn? He says it's still inappropriate, halachically speaking, problematic. How so? Because we have a line in the Gemara. The Gemara teaches us. The Zohar also teaches us. The Gemara reads, the chal psuka delay paske Moshe, any pasuk, which means the word pasuk we translate as verse. Verse. But the word pasuk actually literally means a stop, meaning there's a stop in the words that create the verses. So the chal psuka, any stop, any verse. The Leipaske Moshe, which Moshe Rabbeinu did not put a stop at. The verses, the separation of verses was created by Moshe Rabbeinu. So any verse that Moshe Rabbeinu did not create, Anan Leipaskino, we don't make that stop. Which means that we are required to recite an entire verse at a time. One cannot say half a verse. And therefore, says the Mishna Berura, it's actually halachically problematic to begin with Al Kayn, because it's the middle of a verse. The verse begins with Ki Sheish Yamim. The paragraph starts with Zachar, but the verse starts with Ki Sheish Yamim. Al Kayn is in the middle of a paragraph. So the Mishna Berura, the Chaim, is not concerned with the fact that the Al Kayn contextually doesn't make sense. You're starting off with and therefore. That maybe not so concerned with, because everybody knows you're standing and doing this for Kiddush. So maybe the therefore is like everybody knows you're talking about the holiness of Shabbos. Maybe. He doesn't really address that directly, but his main concern is a halachic issue that one is not allowed to break up a pasuk in such a fashion that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't. And here you're in the middle of a pasuk. This is the Chaim's concern. Yeah? Which would mean it seems that he's pasking a halachic ruling. That you're better off just saying hagafen, which is the halachic kiddush, than saying a half a pasuk, right, which violates a different halacha that you're not allowed to break up a pasuk. Yeah? What do you want to say?
No, I just can't think.
Yeah. So this is the Chaim, this is the Mishna Berura.
Shows you how well they know.
How well they thought, how deeply they thought. Okay, now comes Rabbi Yechiel Michael Epstein in the Aruch Hashulchan, also again in chapter 189. The Rabbi of number, 289, I'm sorry, thank you. We are remembering and paying attention. Thank you. Okay, left-hand column, last word. V'yesha omrim. By the way, this Aruch Hashulchan, just before the paragraph I put here, Alan, he makes your point that the word yoim means 24 hours, and therefore the day Kiddush cannot be biblical, because biblically speaking, it means 24 hours. It's only an illusion because of the extra word, as we explained. So he validates your position. He makes that point very strongly.
I taught him.
Okay. So he says, V'yesh omrim, now those that say, Kaydam HaKiddush before the Kiddush, Psukei Zachar Siyar Shabbos, they say the Psukim of Zachar Siyar Shabbos, the Yeshim Aschilin are those that begin Al Kayn Bayrach with the words Al Kayn. He doesn't mention the custom of Shamru. He mentions the custom of people who start with the Zachar, and there are those who start off with Al Kayn. Now he says, now he validates this custom of beginning with Al Kayn, even though it's in the middle of a pasuk. He writes, even though this is the middle of a pasuk, it's still okay. The ein kavanos el pasuk. His intention is not to recite a verse, just to add words to his kiddush. This is a very important idea, which we're going to reiterate soon. That this prohibition, not to make a break in the verses where Moshe Rabbeinu did it, is not a universal issue. I'm never allowed to recite a half a pasuk. Is that the halacha? If I'm giving a speech and I want to quote 3 or 4 words from a verse to make a point, I'm not allowed to do that. I have to say the whole pasuk. That's not my intention here. My intention is just to recite some words. I'm allowed to do that. If my intention is to create a verse, then I'm not allowed to. And we'll see in a second where that would come into play. Primarily, when you're breaking up the Torah reading. We already have set points at the Torah reading when you break up the aliyahs. It's already set in stone. But not always was it like that. You have to have a minimum. The Gemara says to have a minimum of 7 people get an aliyah on Shabbos Day. But you could add 10, 15, 20, whatever. In Sephardic communities, they still do it. Yeah. They still do it because that halachically speaking, there's nothing wrong with that. But the Gabbai has to know where to tell the person reading where to stop. Mm-hmm. You can't stop in the middle of a pasuk because you're not allowed to create an ending in a verse where Moshe Rabbeinu didn't.
So they don't stop in the middle. They stop.
No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't stop in the middle of a verse. They wouldn't even stop in the middle of a parsha. You know, there's the gaps in the Torah, the spaces. Right. They would stop there specifically, right? Because any break point that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't make, we don't make. But to quote a few words from a verse, nothing wrong with that. So whereas it's perhaps almost like this. They're arguing as to whether the verses you read before the Bayrach on Shabbos Day, is that like an official recitation of verses? And if it is, you can't start in the middle, as per the Mishna Berura. If it's not so official, you're just kind of adding words to like augment your kiddush. Okay, so it's middle of a pasuk, so what? You're not breaking the verses up anew. You're just saying words, just like you're giving a drasha and you're quoting 2 words from a pasuk. You're allowed to, right? The ein kavanos la pasuk. No one's intention here is to create a new pasuk that begins with Al Kayn. We're just saying words to augment our kiddush. No problem, says the Aruch Hashulchan. Following? Mm-hmm. Then it concludes. Okay, this is really the end of our discussion, but I want to read the next part because it's nice in terms of how we learn our Gemara. And we'll add a little detail to our discussion of the evolution of the Shabbos Day Kiddush. He continues. Etc. There are those that say the chapter in Tillim, which we do say right at the beginning. That's our first paragraph we say. There are those that say the section of the Torah that describes the bozichin, the certain offerings in the temple. Yeah, others say that. We don't say it, but others do. Then he concludes, from the Gemara it's clear, lehedja quite clearly, shaloi amru shum davar, they didn't say anything, Bayrach, pasli v'berches hagafan v'shasi. They only said hagafan and drank. What's his proof?
The one where Rav Ashi went to...
Rav Ashi came to Mechuzah and he picked up a cup of wine. He wasn't sure. Did they say the full bracha afterwards or not? So let me say hagafan and long. The Gemara doesn't say, and how does the Gemara say it? The Gemara says, Rav Ashi thought to himself, this is what he says. Rav Ashi thought to himself, Mechti, let's see, Kala brachas, all the brachas, the Berei Priyagafen Amri. Berei, should we say Berei Priyagafen first? We say Berei Priyagafen first. So obviously they didn't say anything before then. Which means in the Gemara's time, all they did was Berei Priyagafen. Maybe some people after Berei Priyagafen did the whole bracha like Friday night.
They nixed that.
But then they nixed it in Mechuzah. So it's just Berei Priyagafen.
After.
Not even before. Because Rav Ashi came and said, every bracha starts with Berei Priyagafen. And he did it slowly, which means all he said was Berei Priyagafen. That's right. Which means all he did was Berei Priyagafen. Now I'm going to add to this and say even more. If that's the case, that means in the Gemara's time, they didn't say Vayachulu before the Kiddush Friday night either. Because what does Rav Ashi say? Rav Ashi says, all brachas begin with Berei Priyagafen. If Rabbi Epstein is deriving from that Shabbos day he began with Berei Priyagafen, didn't say any psukim before, the Gemara's phrasing is that all Kiddushim start with Hagafen. That means Friday night you also start with Hagafen without saying anything before. So maybe he said Vayachulu in his Ma'ariv, because the Gemara says, we learned this yesterday, that anyone who says Vayachulu on Friday night, it's if he becomes a partner with Hashem in the creation of the world. So there's a value to saying Vayachulu, but it doesn't have to be in your Kiddush. Maybe in the Friday night service you said Vayachulu, like we do. We say it 3 times. We say Vayachulu in Shemon Esrei, and then after Shemon Esrei together with the Chazan, then again in Kiddush. So maybe he did it there. But at Kiddush, it would seem, if we're learning the Gemara this way, then when Navashi says we always start with Hagafen, literally start with Hagafen, nothing before, then that means Friday night you didn't say Vayachulu either, which is quite interesting. Yamashi Shivayachulu wouldn't say any of that. That's right. Because if Rabbi Epstein's deriving that Shabbos Day, he didn't say anything because he said we always begin with Hagafen, then take that literally. We always begin with Hagafen, even Friday nights. Perhaps.
Could he mean that when he's saying that he means the bracha?
Oh, so if he means the brachas always start with Hagafen, then it would be no proof. And maybe he did say things Shabbos Day before. But Rabbi Epstein is proving from here, if Rabbi Epstein is learning that Shabbos Day, he didn't say anything before, considering the fact that the Gemara says we always begin with Hagafen, then that applies to Friday night either. If we're learning as you learned, which is how I learned to begin with, that when he said we always begin with Hagafen, he doesn't mean you begin literally with Hagafen. He means you begin the brachas with Hagafen. But maybe I said other things before. Then Friday night also he said other things before. But if, as Rabbi Epstein's learning, when he said we always begin with Hagafen, he means literally we always begin with Hagafen, nothing before, then that applies to Friday night too. Right? This is just an interesting little sidebar. Back to our main point, we have a dispute whether it's okay to begin with Al Kayn. The Mishna Berura says it's a problem because one does not break a pasuk in half. And Rabbi Epstein says the Aruch Hashulchan said no problem. That's only an issue when you're officially trying to cut a verse in half. You're not officially trying to cut a verse in half. You're just quoting words, and you're allowed to quote a half a pasuk.
Using it as an embellishment.
You're looking at you're using an embellishment. You're quoting words. And just like when you give a speech, he doesn't say this, but I'm saying this. Just like when you give a speech, you're allowed to quote a half a verse. So you're quoting a half a verse. That's wrong. Okay.
But it's not part of that verse.
Which one? No, in the Torah,
The Al Kayn.
the words Al Kayn is in the middle of a pasuk.
No,
It's
is it at the end?
on our siddur. It's printed that way in bold, which the Shara Kotel addressed yesterday. But those words are lifted from the pasuk in the Chumash, and the pasuk in the Chumash doesn't have any bold Al Kayn. It's just in the verses, and it's a half a verse. The verse begins with Ki Sheish Yamim, because God created the world in 6 days, therefore He rested on the 7th. And the siddur it was selected and bolded, and Rabbi Lavut yesterday explained why it's bolded, because that's the highlight. But it's still, technically speaking, words from a pasuk that's in half.
So that's an extract out of that verse.
Correct. Which the Mishna Berura is saying, you may not do that. You may not do an extract unless you're doing the entire verse. Whereas the Aruch Hashulchan says, no, the problem of extraction is only when you're making an official break in the verse. And here you're just quoting words, nothing wrong. Okay. Now look at the next, flip the page over. And now we're looking at a work by Rabbi Avram Chaim Naeh. So right in the top, he lived from 1890 to 1954. So he's born a little bit after the scholars mentioned before. Is it even an overlap in time? Yeah, there's an overlap in time, but he's still a little bit young. No, sorry, he was born after they both of them passed away, but not so long after, a decade or two after. He's a very important Chabad halachic ruler, Rabbi Avram Chaim Naeh, was born in Hebron, lived in Yerushalayim, was involved in the formation of the ultra-Orthodox halachic authority structure that exists today, known as the Eidah Charedis in Yerushalayim. He was very heavily involved in creating that. He was Safar Tadaina. He was the official scribe of the Beis Din. He was a member of the founding committee, a very important scholar there. Didn't have a yeshiva, but served as rabbi. He was also part of the Kol Chabad. He was very, very active.
Pretty young.
Chabad thinker. Sorry.
Young.
Yeah, he passed away quite young. How old is he? 64 years old. Yeah, not so old. But he wrote a lot. Very prolific writer, and a very important Chabad. He also had a very colorful life. The Rashab sent him on shlichus to Samarkand. He went on shlichus back from Israel back to Russia, Samarkand and Uzbekistan, and then went back to Yerushalayim. He's most famous for his polemic, if you will, with the Chazon Ish about the correct measurements of Revius, all the measurements in Torah. He dedicated quite a bit of his life to researching what exactly the right thing is and giving us proper measures of nowadays into inches and centimeters into ounces. He describes how he did like experimentation using very precise scales, crushing matzah, weighing it, measuring it, putting it into water, making it float. Right? There's a way how you measure things, measure volume by putting displacement measurements. He did all kinds of things like that. And some of his stuff, it's very central to that whole subject of the exact size of things. He's a very big part of all of it. He's a very big part of that discussion, different than the Chazon Ish, which makes things much bigger than him. That's probably what he's most famous for.
It's funny, I just sold a gold coin, and she said, we have to weigh it. And she put it into water.
Displacement. Yeah. So he was probably most famous for that, for this study. But he wrote a lot. And one of the things he wrote was a gloss on the Shara Koilel. So the Shara Koilel, which we learned yesterday, we explained, is Rabbi Avram David Lavut, the Rabbi's great-grandfather, the Rabbi of Nikolaev, which we said lived. When did we say lived? I lost the page already. But he lived in the early 1800s, about 100 years before. And he, as I mentioned, made it his mission to collect the various different prints of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and try to, number one, between all of them, find the correct liturgy of the Alter Rebbe Siddur, and write a commentary to explain why the Alter Rebbe chose this way and why the Alter Rebbe chose that way, which we learned yesterday, why he chose the Kayn and why the Kayn is bold. Right? We learned that yesterday. That's a classic example. Now, Rabbi Chaim Naeh took a different approach to the Alter Rebbe Siddur. He also did his own research, collected old prints. He didn't have as many of the old prints as Rabbi Lavut did, because he's living in Yerushalayim and it's 100 years later, so maybe some of the older prints weren't around. But he did his own research, and he actually wrote his own commentary on the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, the Hashulchan, the Hashulchan. And he wrote a little booklet called Kuntres HaSiddur, which means the pamphlet of the Siddur, in which he responds to Rabbi Lavut's commentary, disagreeing with Rabbi Lavut. And it's actually printed in the back of the new volume of the Shara Koilel, the new volume of Rabbi Lavut's teaching. In the back, they put Rabbi Chaim Naeh's glosses. Kuntres means pamphlet, a booklet of the Siddur. Now, Rabbi Avram Chaim Naeh takes actually a very different approach to understanding the Alter Rebbe Siddur. Rabbi Lavut's approach is that whenever you see anomalies in the Alter Rebbe Siddur, with, let's say, the practice is different than the Shulchan Aruch, sometimes it's like that. The Alter Rebbe Siddur, the conclusion he writes of how to behave in the Siddur is different than the Shulchan Aruch. Mm-hmm. So we as Lubavitchers, as Chabadnik, we follow the Siddur, because as I explained once, the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe was really a collection of all the teachings from the generations before him and collating it for the world at large, whereas the Siddur was his own thinking for his community, to a large degree, although he also wanted it to be widespread, but it was much more of his own thinking. And it was printed, it was published and worked on years after the Shulchan Aruch. So we follow what it says in the Siddur.
Unless the parentheses. Right?
The parentheses, yeah. So the question becomes, what's the thinking that goes into the Alter Rebbe to make it different in the Siddur versus the Shulchan Aruch? Mm. So Rabbi Lavut's approach is that whenever you see a difference between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch, it's because the Siddur is more Kabbalistically inclined, whereas the Siddur is more strictly halachically inclined.
No, you mean
the Shulchan Aruch is more strictly halachically inclined, whereas the Siddur is incorporative of more Kabbalistic ideas. And you saw this yesterday in Rabbi Lavut's commentary. He's showing us how these paragraphs come from the Pri Etz Chaim, and the Kayn is bold because Kabbalistically speaking, it's God's name. And by the way, that whole idea that Friday night is we accept the Shabbos and Shabbos Day is God blessing, it comes from the Zohar. In fact, there's a passage in the Zohar, since we're learning about Yavitz on Shabbos afternoon, I looked up Yavitz's Siddur, and he puts that paragraph into the Siddur itself, that you should read it before Kiddush, you should read that paragraph in the Zohar. So that's his approach, that the Siddur is Kabbalistically inclined, and that's why it's sometimes divergent from the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Avram Chaim Naeh takes a different approach. And his approach is, yes, the Siddur incorporates lots of Kabbalah, but when you see a difference between the Siddur and the Shulchan Aruch, it's because the Siddur, the Alter Rebbe is ignoring any leniencies. The Shulchan Aruch might say collect from 6-7 opinions, and if the stringent opinion is in the minority, he'll go with the majority, which is lenient. In the Siddur, he'll incorporate even the most stringent opinions that are in the minority. That's how he understands the Alter Rebbe Siddur. So there's divergent of opinion, and this difference of view comes up quite a bit in their respective commentaries.
There seem to be such divergent
approaches
where it sounds like it could be easily deciphered who's correct.
I don't know that I'm...
Because you'd have to see it. Is it really true that all of these
Okay, so that's a
If
question.
what's in the siddur are the actually strict opinions, then you'd say, yeah, okay, this makes sense.
Yeah, so
right?
so that's a good point, but you have to be a scholar enough to be able to do that.
Oh, really?
To go through all the sources and compare them, and this
Yeah.
it's not a simple work. And I once listened to a class by a friend of mine. I grew up with here in Montreal. He's a wonderful scholar. He's a Rosh Hashiva in New York. I was listening to a class of his, and he argues that the Rebbe learns the way Chaim Naeh does, not the way his great grandfather Ram David Lavut does. Either he's right or he's wrong, and he bases this on the way the Rebbe makes citations to the Haggadah. Right, there was a commentary to the Haggadah, and there was a commentary on the Haggadah is based on the Alter Rebbe's Siddur, which has the Haggadah in the Siddur, and based on the way the Rebbe comments on the Alter Rebbe's Haggadah, he concludes that the Rebbe learns the way Rabbi Chaim Naeh does, and not the way Rabbi Lavut does. Either he's right or he's wrong, but he makes a good case at any rate. I'm just saying that takes a lot of scholarship to just come to just say it's one way or this way. But a divergent views. I'm just giving some background to this, to what's going on here.
Whatever it is, it's all in good intent.
Oh, certainly, it's all part of Torah and all worthy of learning. Okay, so now let's read Rabbi Chaim Naeh's gloss to the comment we read yesterday from Avram David Lavut. So you can see on the bottom actually the picture there of Rabbi Avram Chaim Naeh. You can see he's a very beautiful and good-looking man. Yeah, real erudite and prolific scholar. Very, very important scholar in Chabad. Like in any modern Chabad halachic authority will cite to his work as proof text for what they're, because he's like the most recent authority on the Alter Rebbe's Hashulchan Aruch and Siddur. Okay, so he writes, "B'siddur Kiddush Le'ma Shabbos," in the order of the Shabbos Day Kiddush, pasuk al Kayn, the pasuk al Kayn Bayrach, that part of the pasuk, Hitvis has been printed, but oisis gedelos in bigger words. Right, is in bold. Ubeshara Koilel Sham, Rabbi Lavut in Shara Koilel, yesterday we read this. Kosav writes, quote, Zocher Sema Shabbos Lekachoi, the psukim beforehand where we say, remember the Shabbos, Zewa called Pulas Yisrael, this is all the Jews' investment in Shabbos. The Achakach, and afterwards, Al Kain Berach Hashem, therefore God blessed, this is Hashem's response. V'lachein, therefore, B'siddur HaTevis, Al Kain Berach, and therefore the words Al Kain Berach in the Siddur, Hein Ba'oisis Gedolos, are in bigger, bolder words, like a Chatzei Pasuk addition, unlike the first half of the Pasuk, which is printed regularly. And likewise, in a book called Mishnas Chassidim, the words Al Kain are highlighted by adding like these two apostrophes into the words, which we explained yesterday. End quote from the Shara Koilel. Okay, so this we know, we said this yesterday. Rabbi Naeh is quoting just the relevant sections because he's going to comment on this. Okay. And in short, Al Kain Berach is bold because that's the main point here. Everything he said till Al Kain is us describing our investment in Shabbos. Al Kain Bayrach is in bold because it's Hashem's response. Hashem blesses the infinite blessing in response to our blessing of Shabbos.
That's different than what we learned yesterday, right? We learned that it was the Shabbos night time Kiddush that we do, and then what we do on the day is Hashem's response.
That's correct.
Particularly that
right. But the paragraph before Rabbi Lavut said yesterday is us describing what we did. So we're telling Hashem, look, we're keeping the Shabbos.
It's a reiteration.
It's a reiteration to tell Hashem. That's right. To tell Hashem, look, we're observing the Shabbos, and therefore you are blessing the Shabbos.
Yeah.
And that paragraph, and therefore you are blessing the Shabbos, is bold. Okay. So says Rabbi Chaim Naeh, from Chaim Naeh. V'hine now, dvar of his words, Shom over there, Biltim Mizbarim Kalkach, are not so clear to me. Okay, even though we had a beautiful way of understanding it yesterday, in his mind, it's not written clearly enough. Okay, we'll leave it alone. Look, I'm allowed to be biased to my ancestor and say I understood it, even though Rabbi Chaim Naeh says it's not so clear. Okay, but here's a good question that Rabbi Chaim Naeh poses, which I am nowhere near a scholar enough to defend, and specifically because he requires research. He says like this: Gam Masha Kosav, also that which Rabbi Lavut said, V'lachein b'siddur, and therefore in the siddur, etc. The words Al Kain are bold, right? Rabbi Lavut explains why the Al Kain is bold. So Rabbi Chaim Naeh is a little bit, I want to say annoyed, but he's perturbed here. Is that the right word? Perturbed? Loi kosa be'eze siddur. Rabbi Lavut did not say which siddur printing are you talking about. He just said in the siddur is bold. Well, which print? I have a bunch of prints. I just collected a bunch of prints to do some research on the Alter Rebbe siddur. You didn't say which one you're talking about. You're making the statement that it's printed in bold. Well, which printing? Im Yashan, is it an older print? Im Chadash, is it a newer print? And then he says, the Besider Kapust, the Siddur printed in the town of Kapust, and then he cites the two more printings. One is in a city that the letters are Beis Daled, and one is in a city that's Kuf Beis. I'm not sure what these two places are, Beis Daled and Kuf Beis. I think Beis Daled is Bardichev, because Bardichev did have a printing house, and Kuf Beis, I'm not sure what Kuf Beis is. There must be some other printing. So he says, look, in those printings, Kapust, and then these other two printings that I have, HaPosuk Al Kayn, the Posuk Al Kayn Bayrach, Shavam Psuchim HaKodim are printed equally in size to the other Psukim, but Lishim Hefer, without any distinction. So you're saying in the Siddur Al Kayn it's made in bold. Well, which printing? I have three printings from before your time where it's printed equally. The Kayn who be Siddur Ashkenaz, in the Ashkenazic Siddurim, meaning the non-Alter Rebbe Siddurim, the classic Ashkenazi Siddurim, and he cites the three of them. The first one is Shin He Shin, which I think stands for Shar Shemayim. The second Siddur is Yavetz Siddur. And the third Siddur is Ayin Yud, which I'm not sure what Ayin Yud stands for. Someone listening knows what they are, please tell me. Okay, so three more Siddurim, not Chabad, classic Ashkenazi, also the Al Kayn is equal in size. Rak B'Siddur Zitomer, only in the printing that comes from the town Zitomer, also Al Kayn Beirach should have been. They made Al Kayn in a separate line, but it's not even bold there either. So I don't know what you're talking about, Rabbi Lavut. So again, I'm not a scholar enough to go defend, and certainly you have to do the research to find all the Siddurim that may have been available to Rabbi Lavut and see why he's concluding that the Al Kayn is bold. But Rabbi Noah is not happy. And therefore he says, you have to investigate the early prints. You have to really investigate the earliest prints to know if indeed the bolding is correct and if indeed comes from the Alter Rebbe. Follow?
Okay. The Babylonian sidders?
The earliest Babylonian siddur is from Amram Goin, which comes way after the Gemara is written. Or does Amram Goin is one before, is by Naeh Goin, I believe. Post-Talmudic era is the first time there's a proper siddur.
Why is it arguing about the boldness?
Because Rabbi Lavut is arguing that the reason why Al Kayn is bold,
you can say
it's because this. Not yet. We'll get there.
Not there.
In the meantime, he's arguing the point. Rabbi Lavut says the reason why it's bold is because this is the highlight. It's Hashem responding and saying, "I'm therefore God bless the Shabbos." Whereas Rabbi Naeh says, "I'm not so sure the bolding is intentional." Some prints have them bold, but many don't. In fact, the most of them I see don't, except for the Shishomar one has it in bold. So you're making this assertion that it's in bold intentionally. I'm not so convinced. So he's not really arguing the point that Shabbos Day Kiddush is God's response. He's not arguing that point. Because as I mentioned, that comes from the Zohar.
He's not arguing that.
No, he's just arguing the point as to whether that's why it's written in bold.
Very exacting.
Yes. So you can see it's a polemic, right? He's writing a siddur, he's writing a gloss to Rabbi Lavut's commentary, because as I mentioned before, he takes a different approach to the siddur. So he's kind of like, if you could use this language, taking it apart. So everywhere he can, he's like showing, look, you see, he missed.
Very exact.
It's a polemic. It's certainly a polemic, this work. It's a gloss. It's written as a gloss. He has other works on the siddur, but this is specifically a gloss on Rabbi Lavut's commentary. So in every paragraph, he's going to be taking it apart and saying, look, you see this, you see this, you see this. And besides, it's not clear in any way, it's written in a file.
Lavut couldn't respond because he
had passed away years earlier.
So.
Yeah. So it's on me and you.
Right.
These guys,
Yeah.
just for one line.
Now he continues. Okay, now gets to our question. Then he says, the Mishna Berura, Siman Reish Betes, the Mishna Berura, chapter 289, which we just read. Kasav, he writes, quote, we read this quote earlier. V'yesh mahamoin, there are many in the masses. Shepoischim al Kayn Bayrach, which begin with al Kayn Bayrach. And we said before the Mishna Berura is concerned, Shalai it's incorrect. The Chol Psukot like Paskinon, Moshe, Anan like Paskinon, any word, any verses that Moshe didn't break, we shouldn't break. Right? That was Rabbi Lavut. That was the Mishnah Berura's position, that one shouldn't start from Al Kayn. Now, says Rabbi Chaim Noah, I'm not so concerned with his concern. I agree with Rabbi Epstein. He doesn't quote Rabbi Epstein, but he actually substantiates Rabbi Epstein's claim. And the way I explained Rabbi Epstein earlier was based on this. He writes, even though when you are citing to a verse in a manner of prayer, there's no problem with breaking up a pasuk in half. Ayin, Magen Avram, Siman Reish Bein Beis, Ein Kamakom Laharech. Look up the Magen Avram, which is an earlier commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. So I looked it up. That's what I was doing before we started. Where there he writes, as I explained, this issue of breaking psukim in half is only when you're reading from the Torah. And when you're reading from the Torah and you're actually giving an official break to a pasuk, you're not allowed to break in half. But in terms of prayer, no problem. And Rabbi Naeh actually cites to a proof also from Kiddush. We begin Kiddush Friday night with what words? Yom HaShishi. The words Yom HaShishi is not a complete verse. It's the last two words of the previous verse. The verse begins by Yechulu. Yom HaShishi is the end of the last verse. When the Torah describes creation, at the end of every day, it says it was day and night, and it was the first, Yom HaShishi was the first day. Day and night, it was the second day. And then it says, day and night, Yom HaShishi was the sixth day. And then the pasuk goes on by Yechulu. So Yom HaShishi is actually two words from a previous pasuk. And yet we all say it. So you see proof in middle of prayer, especially associated with Kiddush, there's no problem with having a pasuk said in half.
But is that, but there are those who don't even say those.
There are people who don't say Yom HaShishi in Friday Night Kiddush. Maybe.
I'm saying way back.
Oh, could be, yes. But
it may not be.
It's common practice. Okay, but the point is, I maybe I didn't look up the Mishnah Berura, but it would seem, I'm assuming, that the Mishnah Berura makes no comment about the problem with saying Yom HaShishi Friday night.
Right.
And yet he's okay with that, but he's a problem with Kayn. And that's what Rabbi Chaim is saying. Right. So even though I'm not supporting the Mishnah Berura's position, I'm actually on Rabbi Epstein's side, even though he doesn't quote Rabbi Epstein, but he substantiates Rabbi Epstein's claim. First of all, they make by citing to a source which says that the issue is breaking a verse in half is only an issue when you're reading from the Torah, not an issue when you're in prayer. And proof, because we say Yom HaShishi Friday night, and Yom HaShishi is only last two words of a verse.
Mishnah Berura doesn't have it's an issue to that.
That doesn't seem so. Okay, and he continues. He gives other examples. Kayn, Pasuk Vayivarcheu Sham Kavodecha Vayivarach David. In the paragraph Vayivarach David in our Shachris prayer, after Baruch Hashem La'olam, when we stand up in the middle of davening before Yishtabach, we say the paragraph Vayivarach, and there too we quote a half a pasuk. Pasuk Vayivarach Hashem Kavodecha. Who ends the pasuk in Nehemiah Tes. It's the middle of the pasuk in Nehemiah chapter 9. I'm sorry. Before Vayishtabach, there's a paragraph which begins by Baruch David. After Baruch Hashem La'olam, right when we stand up before Yishtabach, we stand up by Baruch Hashem La'olam. After we finish the Hallelujahs, we say Baruch Shamar, right? Yeah, then we say like 5 paragraphs of Hallelujah, and then we say Baruch Hashem La'olam Amen V'Amen. That's when we stand up. The next paragraph begins with the words by Baruch David Hashem, right? Later on, in the middle of that paragraph, we insert a half a verse. By Baruch, which reads by Baruch Hashem Kodecha. So he's saying, look, there too we have a half a pasuk, and no one's concerned with it. Many proofs that if you're doing, like Rabbi Epstein claimed, that if it's in a prayer, there's no problem with half a pasuk. Yes. Nonetheless, says Rabbi Chaim unless so even though there's no halachic problem with starting with Kayn, because there's no problem with saying a half a pasuk in prayer form. But nonetheless, contextually, it's incorrect. To start from and therefore you blessed. What's his concern? The context. The Tevis Kayn, the words and therefore, are attached to the content described earlier. For 6 days God created the world. He rested on the 7th day. Kayn, therefore Bayrach he blessed. But to start off and therefore, without first saying the reason that leads to the therefore, has no understanding.
It could be misinterpreted by those listening.
Correct. So says Rabbi Naeh, I'm not concerned with the pasuk being written in half. I'm concerned with the fact that contextually makes no sense. And if it's you have to start off from the beginning of the message, which would be at least from the pasuk Kisheshes, because God created the world in 6 days, He rested on the 7th, and therefore he blessed it. But to start off, therefore, without saying how you got to the therefore,
use what you said before as the precursor.
The reason why and therefore. So you can't. So he's not concerned with the Mishnah Berura's issue, which is breaking a pasuk in half, because on that issue he sides with Rabbi Epstein that there's no problem with breaking a pasuk in half, even though, but he's worried about starting Kayn for a different reason. So which means now Rabbi Naeh looks at the issue of we have 3 approaches to beginning with to starting at Kayn. The Mishnah Berura says halachic issue, you're breaking pasuk in half. Rabbi Epstein says no problem. It's just prayer. You can say words of psukim even though it's not the whole pasuk. because it's prayer. Says Rabbi Chaim Naeh, it's not a halachic issue, but it lacks meaning. It lacks meaning, and it's inappropriate because it lacks meaning. I can't say there's any halachic issue because you're allowed to begin a statement saying, therefore God rested, but it lacks meaning. So even though he sides halachically, so he's somewhere like a hybrid between the two approaches. He agrees halachically with Rabbi Epstein, but practically speaking, he sides with the Mishnah Berura for a different reason, because contextually it doesn't make sense.
He concurs, but he doesn't.
Okay.
If you left out therefore, it's okay.
If he says, if the person picked up a siddur, instead of starting from Al Kayn, he started from Bayrach. He started off with, God bless the Shabbos and made it holy. Yeah, that would be fine. That would be fine. So actually start from after the words Al Kayn. Exactly.
Alan, you solved it.
Right. It would actually make more sense in Rabbi Noah's position to start off with the word Bayrach.
That's right.
Bayrach Hashem v'sim hashosek Hashem. God bless the Shabbos and made it holy. And good point. Or start earlier. Kisheshes.
Say therefore. What?
Therefore what? Exactly right.
Alan, we'll have to put your picture.
But now,
your name.
Well, you're picturing this. Yeah, it's good. But now let's conclude. Now he comes back to his comment on Rabbi Lavut. So Rabbi Lavut said the reason why the Al Kayn is bold is because it's on purpose. Because this is the main point of the whole thing here, that Hashem blesses the Shabbos. Hashem's response: I bless the Shabbos because of how you observe Shabbos, and therefore Al Kayn is in bold. But says Rabbi Chaim, no, that's a mistake, because the reason why the masses begin with Al Kayn without reading the lines before, which the Mishnah Berura was concerned with that issue of people starting with Al Kayn, even though I'm not concerned for the same reason, but I agree with him, one shouldn't start from Al Kayn. So but why? How did that custom evolve? How did the custom evolve that people should start off with just Al Kayn? So he says, it came from the fact that the words were printed in bold. So Rabbi Noah is actually saying it's a mistake to put the Al Kayn in bold, because you're leading people to start from Al Kayn, and that's a problem. In the Mishnah Berura's position, it's a halachic issue, and in my view, it's a problem contextually. So you're saying, Rabbi Lavut, that the Al Kayn is on purpose printed in bold because it's the main message. Hashem blesses the Shabbos. First of all, I don't know which siddurim you had in front of you. There's plenty of siddurim that don't have it in bold. Number one. Number two, the fact that siddurim nowadays have it in bold is leading people to mispractice. That's why they're beginning with Al Kayn, because it's in bold.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? So he's not really disagreeing with the message that the Shabbos Day Kiddush is Hashem's response. He'll agree with that, especially since it comes from the Zohar. But the way in which he attaches it to the Al Kayn being bold, Rabbi Chaim doesn't like that. And if Rabbi Chaim had the
he says it's contextually, even though halachically it's not incorrect, it's contextually.
Yeah. Well, first of all, even though he might disagree with him, even though he might disagree with the Mishnah Berura, he still understands the Mishnah Berura is a leading authority. And if the Mishnah Berura is concerned with breaking a pasuk in half, there's what to worry about. Although I disagree, but nonetheless,
he's going to defer maybe because of its high standard.
Yeah, which is why he says, look, the fact that the Mishnah Berura is pointing to the masses already 100 years before me, right? Because he's born in 1890. This is 50, 60, 70 years earlier. The Mishnah Berura is already annoyed, so to speak, at the masses who are skipping the first parts and just beginning with Al Kayn. Where'd that come from? It says right now, it's coming from the fact that you guys printed it in bold.
Actually,
and you shouldn't have done that.
The Mishnah Berura may be agreeing with Rabbi Naeh on his point
Correct.
as well. But he's only thinking from a halakhic point of view.
That's right.
So he's only citing the halakha.
Whereas Rabbi Naeh is thinking in the contextually. That's right.
Right.
So now it concludes, therefore, we have to look at the Siddurim printed in the lifetime of the Alter Rebbe. How is it printed there? And so long as it's not been clarified that the Siddurim that the Alter Rebbe himself overseed their printing, we should go with the Siddurim that I mentioned before, which is the majority Siddurim, the one printed in Kapust and the one printed in Beidalid, which I think is Barditchev, where there the Al Kayn is in the same size. Sharei, because Al Siddur Kapust Tofkuf Ayin Vav
Read the whole pasuk.
Kasav Ashar Kol Atzmai Shalai Shina Klum Hanusach Ayin Bagdama. Rabbi Lavut himself said that he followed the printing of the Kapust printing, and he didn't change anything to that printing. But the Kapust printing does not have the Al Kayn in bold.
That's great.
This is, you see his polemic. He's like a real polemic and digging into the Shara Kol's commentary. Okay, it's on me as a grandson of Rabbi Lavut to defend the position. And in our Siddurim, our Siddurim, the Torah the Siddur Tilas Hashem, has it in bold. And the Rebbe oversaw that printing. So
and the Rabbi,
maybe the Rebbe went along with his grandfather's interpretation. I actually wanted to, with Hashem's help, I will do. I started a little bit to do some investigation as to why the Siddur Torah, the Siddur Tilas Hashem, the Siddur we have, has the Kayn in bold. Because it is in bold, which means they're siding with Rabbi Levut here and not with Chaim Naeh. And I'm wondering why. Maybe because since, like, in other words, Rabbi Naeh says here, let's go find out what the Siddurim had in the times of the Alter Rebbe. Maybe between his life and nowadays, that Siddur from the Alter Rebbe's time actually is available. And maybe they're basing it on that. I wonder. So I started a little bit of research. I didn't do full research, but I do hope, God willing, by Monday to have an answer as to why our Siddur that we have today, which is printed after both of these commentaries, which means the publishers knew about both of these views, they still publish, and especially since the Rebbe oversaw that printing, the Kayn is in bold. And I don't imagine it's simply because the Rebbe is just relying on his great-grandfather, because there are many places where I've seen the Rebbe quotes his great-grandfather, Shara Kailul. Many times he quotes him and just quotes him as a source. Other times he quotes him and disagrees with his great-grandfather. There are times where I've seen the Rebbe quote his great-grandfather and disagree. So I don't know that just because his great-grandfather did it, he would go along with it. So I'm imagining that there's some thought as to why the Kayn is bold in our Siddurim. And God willing, I will do some research on that and come back on Monday with why that is. But at least we see now here 3 different approaches as to answer the question. Should one start from Kayn? Mr. Berura, no, because a halachic problem, don't break a pasuk. Rabbi Epstein, no problem. Everybody knows what you're talking about. You're talking about Shabbos. We understand what you mean when you say therefore. There's no problem. Whereas Rabbi Chaim Naeh says, no halachic problem, but hey, contextually, it doesn't make sense to say therefore without first explaining what you mean by and therefore.
I think
There we go.
Our practice seems to be that there is no issue starting with Kayn, because even though the rabbi in Kiddush
He quietly says everything before.
He says everything quietly, but people in the audience in the shul
don't know that.
And all they hear is Kayn.
So that's another thing I wanted to find out. I forgot to do.
If that was an issue, it would be more emphasized what's being done.
So So first, as I mentioned, because of this whole discussion, I said this before, when I make Kiddush with my children, I start with Kisheshes out loud. Meaning if I said the whole thing myself quietly and then said Kayn out loud, okay, so I said everything quietly. My children aren't saying everything quietly. They're saying what I say with them out loud. So they should say from Kisheshes, contextually speaking. So I start with that out loud with my children. Kisheshes, I say the whole thing with them. So they learn the pasuk, they learn that. But so it's my own personal practice. But another thing I actually wanted to do, that I wanted to ask someone, I forgot. I want to ask someone here in Montreal who has a very good memory, and he spent much time by the Rebbe's Fabrengens. And there were times where the Rebbe made Kiddush by the Fabrengen. So I forgot. I wanted to say, what did the Rebbe say out loud? I know for sure, I looked this up, and there's a work which goes through the Rebbe's practices and customs and explains them halachically speaking. And there they write that the Rebbe did say all the paragraphs before he made Kiddush at the Fabrengen. Not out loud, but he said all the paragraphs. So I forgot. I want to ask someone, at which point did the Rebbe say it out loud? Or did he say anything out loud at all? Maybe just making Kiddush for himself, because he would make Kiddush, eat some challah, eat some cake actually. For his lechem Mishna, he'd have the cake covered, then he would have cake. Not from lechem Mishna, I'm sorry, for Kiddush Makom Soda, right? We learned that the Kiddush has to be in the place of your meal, so they would have some cake. I'm actually wondering, at which point would the Rebbe speak out loud? Like, at which point did the Rebbe start saying this Kiddush out loud? I wonder. I forgot to ask someone. I'm going to do that, God willing, and Monday we'll have maybe some more research on that. God willing.
I'm just a little fisher here, but compared to these guys. But if I were to be writing that paragraph, I'd put the Kayn in big print, but right under the as part of that paragraph.
Without breaking into another line.
That's right.
Interesting. You know what? We have to look up all. You know, I'll do this. I'm going to look up all the old prints and see.
Because that there it makes more sense. I mean, I understand their point of view. They're a bunch of tzaddiks, and when you say therefore, they all know already what it is.
Right.
But when you
the masses,
they don't know.
That's Rabbi Naeh's problem. The reason why the masses are starting from Kayn without realizing what they're saying is because it's in bold, and it's not correct.
That's right.
But nonetheless, our Siddurim have it in bold, which means
it could be in
the publishers of our Siddurim knew all of this, and they still put the Kayn in bold. Well, they must have something, and I have to do some research.
It could be in bold, but to join it to that paragraph.
Our Siddurim have it in a separate line.
I know.
So I'm wondering what they were thinking. So I have to look up.
It should be part of that paragraph.
It could be that there were so many versions of this of the Rebbe Siddur floating around that just by happenstance one was
That's what
for
Rabbi.
publication, and that's what happened.
That's what Rabbi Noah is saying. Until you find me a siddur that was actually printed in the lifetime of the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe saw it, until such point, leave the Alkain unbolded. That's Rabbi Noah's argument.
Yeah.
And yet ours is bold.
That's what happened to go to print.
Yeah, and yet ours is bold. So we have to find out why. And God willing, I'll have the answer on Monday. Sorry?
I have the old sitters from the 1800s.
It's not the Alter Rebbe's one though.
No.
You know, but look it up. Look it up. Look up those. Look at it. So look after Musaf on Shabbos morning. The next page or two will be Kiddush, and look it up.
I'll have to find Musaf.
You'll find it. Okay, wonderful day, Eden. Good Naeh Shabbos.
I want to bring a couple of books here.